Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Ugreen NASync DXP4800 Plus. This NAS is a part of Ugreen's new NAS lineup that's going to be launching on Kickstarter soon, and today I'm going to be taking a look at this NAS and see what Ugreen has to offer. I'm going to take a look at the hardware inside this NAS and also take a look at their software and look at what features they offer. This video is sponsored by Ugreen, and they've provided this NAS pre-release for me to take a look at. They've also provided links that I've put in the video description if you want to get a discount on this NAS when buying early. Ugreen is also offering a discount of these new NAS units on Kickstarter. For the first 48 hours of this video, or these times here, the NASs will be 40% off, and until May 9th, the NASs will be up to 35% off. And they've also provided a few talking points that I'm going to use in this video, but all the testing and performance figures are those of my own. This DXP4800 Plus is one of 6 models in the new NASync lineup. The main differences between these models are the number of hard drive bays, processors, and connectivity. As you move up the lineup, you get more hard drive bays, going up to a total of 8 bays on the high-end model, as well as a 4 M.2 drive model. Connectivity gets faster on higher-end models, with optional Thunderbolt on higher-end models, as well as a PCI Express slot for putting optional expansion cards in. Higher-end models have faster networking as well as a faster built-in processor. But all of these units feature at least 2.5 gigabit networking, which is great to see on these units, 8 gigabytes of RAM on all models with the option to expand to more later on, as well as 2 M.2 2280 NVMe SSD slots on the bottom. Let's take a look at what I got on my unit now. Included in the box for this NAS is the actual NAS itself, 2 network cables that are Cat7 rated, power brick to plug it into the wall, as well as some keys to lock the drive bays and screws to mount in 2.5-inch drive bays. Talking about the drive bays on the system, these 4 drive bays allow for drives up to 24 terabytes currently, for a total of up to 96 terabytes of hard drives in this NAS. These are actually one of my favorite drive bays I've seen on almost any bit of equipment. Easy to remove and completely toolless with a quite convenient just pop it out and the drive comes out like this mechanism. And if you want to use 2.5-inch drives, those screws included for being able to mount those as well. Taking a look at the front of this physical unit, in addition to the 4 drive bays, is a power button, indicator lights for the network connectivity as well as drive status of all the 4 drives, a SD card slot, as well as a Type-C and Type-A USB port. Moving over to the back of the unit is actually an interesting design choice I haven't seen in other NASs, which is a dust filter. And for this dust filter to work, it actually is an intake fan at the back instead of an exhaust, and the hot air comes out the front. Also on the back includes more connectivity. On the case of my model, I have a power connectivity, a little insert reset switch to reset the network settings on this model, dual network jacks, one is 10 gigabit and one is 2.5 gigabit, dual USB 2 ports, a USB 3.2 port, as well as an HDMI port for playing back media on a TV or monitor. On the bottom of this unit is a little panel. Once the 2 screws are removed, you can see the 2 M.2 2280 NVMe SSDs that can be added inside, as well as a single 8 gig DDR5 SODIMM, and there's space for a second SODIMM if you want to expand the memory later on. These are all the user serviceable parts in the system, but I wanted to dive deeper and take a look at what this board is and how it works internally. So after taking 4 screws out of the back of the system, I can remove the back cover and see the main cooling fan inside. It's a 140mm cooling fan that luckily is a PC standard fan if it needed to be replaced for some reason later on. Taking out a couple more screws allows me to slide out the whole unit from the outside casing and see the internal drive caddies, the back plane for all the drives, as well as the main processing board. Taking a look at the main processing board, I can see another M.2 slot, which has the 128 gigabyte boot M.2 slot included on it. Taking a look at the other side of this board shows me the heatsink that covers up the Pentium Gold 8505 processor. This is an Intel 12th generation 5-core processor. Now, I haven't heard of that processor before, so I did a little bit of diving on it and ran some tests to kind of see how well it works. This is a 1+4 processor that uses Intel's Alder Lake or 12th gen cores on it. This CPU actually makes a good amount of sense to me, as I think the P-core would be pretty good at handling a lot of single-threaded workloads, and the E-cores can help quite a bit with the multi-threaded workloads. But I wanted to test that, so I ran a couple of CPU benchmarks to see how well it would compare. In single-threaded workloads like the ZSTD benchmark that I ran on it, it did quite well. I also did an encryption benchmark using the AES speed of the CryptSet benchmark on the CPU. Now the interesting thing with that benchmark is that what it uses is these accelerated instructions on lots of CPUs. So even though some older CPUs have a lot more cores, this CPU is optimized for some things like AES and does very well in this benchmark here. I also wanted to take a look at a multi-threaded CPU benchmark to see how well the CPU does when using all of its cores that it has access to. I used FFmpeg's CPU video encoding for this task today. I do want to mention that this system also has an iGPU that it can use and is supported to be used in this OS, but for my testing I used CPU encoding only. While it is definitely slower than higher-end multi-core processors, if I take a look at efficiency and power when running this test, the CPU still looks pretty good and is fairly efficient. And this CPU actually seems to be quite well suited for a NAS. The single P core can speed up a lot of those pesky single-threaded tasks. Having 4 E cores helps speed up a lot of the multi-threaded tasks, and it's a modern, efficient processor. Now, speaking of efficiency, let's take a look at power consumption of this NAS. In idle with the drive spinning, it was pulling about 40 watts from the wall. And that's with the system having 4 WD Red Plus 5400 RPM 4TB drives, as well as 2 M.2 NVMe SSDs. I wanted to find out how much of that power consumption was the actual system itself compared to the drives, so I ripped out all of the drives and measured power consumption again. And in that case, the system was only pulling about 20 watts when idle. So about 20 watts for the CPU and board and other components, and 20 watts for the drives. When I was copying files and moving things around, it peaked to about 45 or 55 watts, which is how much power you'd see using this NAS under most workloads. Pushing the CPU hard, I saw about 67 watts of power consumption, and the highest I ever saw, which was when the iGPU is being used for encoding as well as the CPU is doing tasks, was about 80 watts from the wall. So overall, fairly reasonable power consumption. When it comes to network file copy performance, I tested the system in a basic Samba setup to just see how it would work, and here's a Crystal DiskMark screenshot. It worked just fine, was able to basically fill up 10 gigabit. Now, taking a closer look at this Crystal DiskMark benchmark, I first noticed that the random I/O performance is good, which tells me the CPU can keep up with all those transfers, but also is a lot more than I'd expect from a hard drive, which tells me that it's probably using RAM caching, which is likely going to help with performance a little bit. You can also enable SSD caching on this system if you want the SSDs to cache the hard drive array. Performance does drop off a little bit in large transfers because the hard drives can only handle so much I/O, but that's a limitation of 4 hard drives on these systems, and it's really awesome to see that nothing else in the system is limiting performance other than the hard drives themselves. One other aspect of this NAS to touch on right now is noise level. This NAS is running right next to me and I can barely hear it right now. But when I start accessing files, the hard drive's seek noises get relatively noticeable, but this really depends on the exact drive you're using. Another thing to note is when I'm pushing the CPU hard and it's pulling a good amount of power, I can hear the fans rev up a little bit under CPU load. You can also configure CPU speed in the settings to set it to full speed all the time, normal, or quiet mode. And actually, let's take a look at those settings now. This system is fairly easy to set up. You can go to find.ugnas.com and it'll search your local network for any NAS on it. You can also search your DHCP server to see if it's picked up the NAS there. And now we're into the Ugreen NAS OS. This OS is relatively familiar if you've used other commercial off-the-shelf NAS units, and it's kind of like a desktop-like experience with a desktop with apps on it, kind of a taskbar-like thing at the top, and you can click here to see all of the apps or search for different apps on this unit. And you have different apps for different tasks you might want to do. Let's take a look at Storage Manager now, as it's likely one of the most important aspects of a NAS. Storage Manager here lets you set up all the standard RAID arrays like 0, 1, 5, 10, and 6. You can also set up SSD caching, and you can set up multiple different volumes. For example, an SSD-only volume and a hard drive-only volume. And it's pretty flexible and uses all the standard setups. I can go under Storage Management now and take a look at the RAID 5 I've already created on here, as well as the SSD cache that I have on this RAID right now. I can see I've used 140 gigs of the cache at a hit rate of 25. Going under Hard Disk Management, I can see all of my different drives and see the health on these. It automatically checks for Smart Health and will report to you if the Smart Health fails. It'll also report to you if one of the drives fails for some instance, and if a drive fails, it'll also bug you with an audible alarm, so you can't really forget about a drive dying on the system and accidentally lose your data. The other great thing with how it does storage is under the hood, it's using open source technologies like BTRFS and MDADM, which means worst comes to worst and this NAS dies for some reason, you can take these drives out, plug them into a Linux system, and access all the data. You can also manage external storage, so for example SD cards or USB sticks, mount them, and access all the files on those drives for relatively easy offloading, so for example an SD card from a camera. The control panel has all the different settings you could want on this NAS, and it goes relatively in-depth, giving you a lot of options that I like to see. Some of these options include a terminal, so you can SSH into the system and see what's going on under the hood. It seems to be a Debian-based OS. It's running like Linux kernel 6.2, and you can poke around in a terminal if you want on this system, which is great to have that ability. You also have the ability to set like hardware settings like fan speeds and LED indicator brightnesses, which is great to see. Network settings if you want it to be easily accessible from other systems out of the network without having to do port forwarding in a router. Setting up file sharing settings, including SMB, FTP, NFS, and other common file sharing services. One of the other great things is if you go in the advanced settings, it goes relatively in depth, so you can do things like SMB3 multi-channel without having to dive into that terminal, which is great to see. And you can also use a file manager on this to take a look at your different files, copy them between different locations, or you can just go on this system and say, hey, I have a file and I want to just download it easily without having to mount the whole SMB share on this system, for example. And I can also like view photos or play videos directly in this interface without having to download the file if I want to. So here's a little video playing right now. In addition to the file manager that can manage all your files, there's also a photo and video manager that can go manage those file types better. So taking a look at the photo manager right now, it gives you quite a few more options for going through photos, identifying things like faces, putting all the different photos on a map, and being able to manage all your photos in one central place and have things like phones and other cameras sync all their files to one location, so it's one big share. The Photos app also uses AI smart recognition on the device to identify the different types of photos and be able to sort and organize between those different photos without using an internet connection. They also have a video center that allows you to manage many different like movies and TV shows, sync it with things like the movie DB so it can get all the correct information about the movie, and be able to do things that are convenient like continue watching a movie that you've started watching on one device and go to another. The other thing is if you're using the movie app on your phone, you can also set the HDMI output as the playback device. So this can be connected to a TV and playback media on it directly without needing another streaming box. And here's the App Center with all the currently available apps on this OS. And while this list is relatively limited now, with Docker and virtual machines coming in the future, you should be able to run pretty much any program on this box with NAS being added. The mobile app on this phone uses the same quick connection thing where it scans your network and finds if you have any NASs to connect to. And once I save my credentials, it's super easy to just log into it. And opening up on my phone, I can see a dashboard that shows me all the status, disk usage, the amount of processor that's being used, and I can see a lot of these same apps right now that I can open, like control panels, and change all of the same settings on a phone, as well as like App Center and seeing all the different apps I could install on it. And it's nice to see a pretty much desktop-like experience on a phone. And also the main ability, which is nice, is to be able to sync all your photos on your phone to this NAS automatically without having to think about it. So if this phone was lost for some reason, I still have all my photos, which is nice to see. I can also download any files on the NAS on my phone using the app, or I can mount the SMB share directly on my phone as well, so that way it's easy to access NAS files on my phone. Overall, I was pretty impressed with this hardware. I was worried that a first-generation product really wouldn't be ready or good, but they really have pulled it off, especially with the hardware. I think this is one of the better hardwares of these NAS products out there, and it comes with quite a good CPU and network configuration to go along with these drives. I think it's hard to beat this unit hardware-wise. And software-wise too, they did pretty good, especially for a whole new OS they seem to be building now. Software updates have been coming pretty quickly when I was testing it and fixed a couple of the little bugs I saw when working with this. And it really didn't have any major issues or problems using it. Working as a basic NAS works great. You can just mount an SMB share and it's easy to do it. And they have a lot of other features on the OS if you want to take advantage of that as well. Let me know if you have any other questions about this NAS in the comments below, and thanks for watching.